Welcome to this important section of the course. We've just completed some fascinating hands-on work with network forensics. You saw how attackers leave behind their footprint in network traffic, and using Wireshark, you investigated several different types of attacks, breaches, and data exfiltration attempts. But you would be surprised to know that most breaches don't happen because the attackers were great. Most breaches happen because preventive measures taken were inappropriate or fell short. So, in addition to being skilled detectives who can uncover how attacks happen and what data was exfiltrated, you also need to be proactive architects who prevent these attacks from happening in the first place. And one key piece of the puzzle in this story is IAM, or Identity and Access Management, which plays a huge role in preventing these type of attacks, or at least minimizing their impact. Now, previously, we used Wireshark to investigate several different types of network breaches, attacks, data exfiltration attempts, and we did that by investigating network traffic. We also followed how attackers access sensitive data, sensitive files, and finally, we also saw how they were able to exfiltrate the data, what were the traces left behind, and how we could uncover what actually happened in the cyber kill chain. But let's pause for a second. Wouldn't it be better if the attacker could never have accessed data in the first place? That's what IAM is all about. So after any security incident, the first key question to ask is that how did the attacker get in the system? But the second question, which is even more important, is that could we have prevented this? So for example, in the credentials.txt file, which was accessed and which contained sensitive credentials, why was a sensitive file like credentials.txt accessible to normal users? And more importantly, could the attacker have been blocked from the start? Like now we are investigating that, okay, they accessed this file, they basically exfiltrated it. Or more recently, in the case of Acme Corporate Lab, we saw how John's system, which had been compromised by malware, it was able to run several different SQL queries to extract information from several different types of tables. And some of those may not even be related to John's day-to-day role. So the real question is that, were the right permissions and access controls in place? This approach is actually much more important rather than investigating post a security incident. And that's exactly what we are going to cover throughout this section. Just to drive the point home, let's discuss the very popular Twitter admin panel hack in 2020. So, at the start, what happened was that attackers, they were able to successfully phish some internal Twitter employees. And as you already know, the consequence of phishing is that some of those employees clicked on those malicious links, which got them to a domain which had the malware and then which got downloaded to their systems and started spreading. So through the malware, the attackers were able to access the admin panel of Twitter. So the admin panel is an internal tool used by Twitter employees, especially the security and support staff, to manage the platform. It's not public and it has very powerful capabilities. And that's why it has always been the target of attackers. So now here's the key point. The admins which had access to those admin panel, and now basically attackers were also able to access the admin panel as admins. The issue was that those admins had wide, sweeping access to user accounts. Now, it is understandable that admins do need a lot more access than normal users. However, those admins even had access to accounts which were very high profile and the type of information that they did not even require for the day-to-day operations. So in this case, 69 high-profile Twitter accounts were hacked, including that of Musk, Obama, and Apple. So they started posting tweets from these official accounts, encouraging followers to basically invest in a new Bitcoin scam. Now, what were the key lessons? Now see, the admin panel and basically the admins definitely need accesses like viewing user information, resetting passwords, suspending or banning accounts, or maybe forcing tweets to be deleted. However, they should not have had complete access, like access to each and every Twitter account and the ability to do anything on those accounts. So the key lesson here was that overprivileged accounts are dangerous. Even if it's an admin account, like the topmost account, even they should not have access to each and every single feature of the system. Now the next logical question would be, well, if they don't have access to each and everything, then how would they manage? Now, here's the key answer. If you have rightly structured the permissions, then you wouldn't have one admin having access to everything. First of all, it will be a group of admins. And secondly, you could have divided admins into different roles, for example. One could be handling like day-to-day things like resetting passwords, unlocking accounts, or other bugs related to accounts. Another role could have handled things like banning accounts or unbanning accounts or shadow banning. So just to give you an example, it's always a bad idea to give one big wide access to any account, even if it's an admin account. And the second is that privileged roles, such as those of admins or super admins, they need even tighter controls. So normally we always have like tight security controls and checks in place to make sure that, so for example, one user shouldn't be able to access the data of another user. This user shouldn't be able to do that. But sometimes we neglect that privileged roles, they need even tighter controls because they can do so much damage. Like in the case of Twitter, social engineering was used to gain access to one of these privileged accounts, which helped turn identity and access management into a weapon. So that same admin account, which was so powerful, that same power was used or leveraged by attackers to do so much damage. And as a result of this Twitter hack, there was so much global panic and confusion, and it was pretty bad. Now, this Twitter admin panel hack was a failure of IAM, not of software, not of firewalls, not of forensic investigators. So we always need to audit and limit what anyone can do, including the admin roles. So in this case, I'm just giving you the example of what could go wrong with an admin account. There are so many other examples which we are going to discuss throughout this section and which are very important for a security analyst, security architect, or security manager to understand and implement. Now, just to put things in perspective, we have already briefly discussed IAM. So IAM is Identity and Access Management, and we already discussed the IAAA framework, which is sort of like the cornerstone of Identity and Access Management. Now we have already covered IAAA, but I'm just going to quickly do a bit of refresher because we're going to do a deep dive. And for that, it's nice that you have this memory fresh. So the first I in IAAA was identification. And what does identification means? It basically means someone just identifies as something. So for example, someone can walk into a bank and say, okay, I'm John Doe. At this point, you haven't verified your identity. You're just claiming something, okay? ID just means I am this system or I am this person. The next step is more important, in which you authenticate. You basically prove your identity. This could be done through passwords, PIN, biometrics. But authentication only comes after identification. So only after you have identified yourself, because authentication is always against a system or a person, right? You can authenticate that, okay, this person is actually this person or this system is actually this system. And non-repudiation basically means that once you have identified and authenticated, then you're sort of bound that whatever activities you do, it will be your responsibility. Then you cannot say that this was someone else doing it. The second A in IAAA was authorization. So, okay, you identified yourself and you authenticated. Okay, you are a legitimate user. Now, the next question is that what type of access do you have? And this can be implemented through access control lists. What are the clearances? So authorization basically means that, okay, you are a legitimate user, but what activities can you perform on the system, for example? And this is sort of like the part which we're going to do a bit deeper dive on in this section. And then finally, the last A was for accountability. You always want to have audit logs, audit trails, and periodic account audits also. We're going to discuss this in much more detail throughout this section, but the basic idea is that we need to have some sort of accountability. So sort of like who will police the police, okay? So you always need checks and balances. Okay, so what topics are we going to cover in this section? So we are going to discuss several different access models like role-based access control, attribute-based access control, and so many others. We're also going to discuss permissions in more detail, the granularity at which you can assign permissions. For example, it could be wide sweeping permissions, or is it like on a database table, or like a particular column within a database, those kind of things. And then roles, through which you can basically define different groups of people who have the same permission. For example, you can have an admin role and anyone in that role will have the same permission. You can have a user's role, you can have a super admin role, and those kind of things. And finally, and very important, how would you enforce identity and access management. How would you enforce these permissions and roles?